Okay, well, hey everybody. Welcome back to Popular Music Books in Process. As many of you know from having been here before, we're a kind of mix of the Journal of Popular Music Studies, which just put out its September issue, the Pop Conference, which is entering its third and final week as the online conference version, and IASPM US, which, so far as I can tell, has no news to report. But those organizations put the series on. We talk about popular music books each week. Welcome to those who are attending for the first time. I hope you come back for other events. One of our sort of rules is if you engage the chat function, you're free to both post comments during the conversation, and at the end, one of us, in this case, this week it's Carl Wilson, will field the questions and sort of call on people to ask those questions. I should also just quickly announce that next week in the series, we have a country music themed week. Peter LaChapelle presenting on I'd Fight the World, a political history of old time hillbilly and country music, along with Stephanie Vanderwell, Hillbilly Maidens, Okies and Cowgirls, Women's Country Music, 1930 to 1960. So what the heck is Alex Ross and a book on Wagner doing in this popular music book series? I went out of my way to ask him because I have always thought that one of the things he does as a critic is make it clear that what we think of, and maybe what wants to sometimes think of itself as a rarefied world unto itself, is hardly that, is absolutely immersed in the world, influences the world, is part of the lived culture of the world. And this book in particular seems to really exemplify that as it spirals through Wagner's afterlives across, I don't know how many categories. Did you make a count? Did you have like rooms of the house with different chapters? So many categories. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, with a particular emphasis, because you couldn't possibly talk about this whole book in a small number of minutes, on Afro-Wagnerism. As part of that, Alex is going to be joined by Kira Thurman. So let me just quickly introduce them. I'll give a kind of short version of their bios. Alex, music critic of The New Yorker since 1996. First book was The Rest is Noise, Listening to the 20th Century. Second book, Listen to This. And he has received a gazillion prizes and awards and things. Really impressive. Kira Thurman is an assistant professor of Germanic languages and literatures and history at University of Michigan, with both a background as a classically trained pianist in Vienna, Austria, a PhD in history from University of Rochester, and a book forthcoming, which is to say it's basically done. Awesome. Singing Like Germans, Black Musicians in the Land of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, with Cornell University Press. So thank you both for being with us today. I think, as per our usual thing, the two of you will talk in whatever fashion feels comfortable for a good while. Folks who have questions, put them in the chat, and then we'll pick up on the other side. So welcome again, and really thanks for being part of our series today.
Thanks. Thanks. So I am up first, everybody. I did prepare comments. They're kind of formal, informal. So occasionally you will see me looking at my other computer screen, and it's because I am sort of reading things out loud. Thanks in advance. Oh, so thanks anyway, before I continue, for Eric for this invitation, Alex as well. Thanks for sort of hosting me this week. So this, we're talking about today a lot about sort of Afro-Wagnerism. So surprise if you didn't realize we're going to be talking a lot about that. That's what's going on. And I'm going to begin our conversation on Wagnerism by instead bringing up Beethoven. This summer, I accidentally became Twitter famous for wading into a debate, was Beethoven Black? And like any good historian and musicologist worth her salt, I said that I wasn't interested in that question so much as the history of it. So Black people have been claiming that Beethoven was Black since at least the 1930s. And the reasons for doing so are complex and layered. On the one hand, sort of it's subversive to associate Beethoven as a sort of quote unquote musical genius with Blackness, which is something that white Americans denied. So this is sort of an argument that Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael made a lot. But on the other hand, and this sort of going to get us, I think, to Alex's book, is thinking about how African Americans had an affinity for the music of Beethoven, and that claiming Beethoven became a way of claiming Western art music for themselves. In both my first book project and my next project, I take seriously Black engagements with classical music and try to consider how their performances, listening practices, compositions both laid claim to, and often undid the bounds of Western art music and racial politics of the day. So for my forthcoming book called Singing Like Germans, Black Musicians in the Land of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, I trace Black musicians mostly from the United States, the Caribbean, and Latin America, who sort of traveled to Germany in the 19th and 20th centuries. And they're there to perform the music of Beethoven and the music of Wagner. And so I look at their performances and how they're sort of understood, and how in particular white audiences in Germany and Austria are understanding them. I have made this joke a ton, so please bear with me, but if Western art music is considered is a universal language, quote unquote, it has a very strong German accent. The music of the Austro-German canon of composers like Beethoven or Wagner is, in a lot of ways, I think a lot of historians and musicologists say is a paradox, right? That it's somehow considered both universal while still being the sort of audible expression of a local or national sense of self. So my question for my first book, which I am turning over next week, hooray, thanks. Right, so my question for my first book was, if this music is considered a quote unquote universal language, what happens when people of color start speaking it, right? And in some ways, it's important to understand that people of color have always been involved in the production and dissemination of Western art music, that we find Black courtly musicians in early modern Germany, Black composers in Spain and Italy writing motets, musicians such as George Bridgetower performing with composers Joseph Haydn and Beethoven in early 19th century Vienna. And so Alex, this is where I'm going to start throwing your own words back at you. This is going to happen a lot, for which I apologize. But in my defense, they're very good words. And that Alex writes in a recent essay that in classical music, quote, Black people have long been marginalized, but they've never been outsiders. Yet white audiences often sort of treated them as such. So my first book sort of demonstrates just how over and over and over again, white audiences in Europe made sense of a lot of these sort of performances by Black musicians by racially demarcating them across a sonic color line, to use a phrase that sort of Jennifer Lynn Stover has used and sort of come up with. So even when singing the music of Schubert or performing a cello sonata by Mendelssohn, Black classical musicians were rendered alien or un-German. The thing that nonetheless surprises most people when I first start chatting to them about the history of Black classical musicians in Germany and Austria is just the sheer number of them. For now, I think I'm just going to focus on the ones I know performed Wagner. I sort of went through a little bit to my notes to see, I'm sure I'm missing a bunch of people. So for example, there's an Afro-Cuban ensemble known as the Jimenez Trio that performed at Wagner's 60th birthday party in 1873. A little after that, Nicasio, who was the cellist in the group and one of the two sons, visited Von Fried and performed for Wagner again. Skipping ahead a little bit, in the 1930s, Marian Anderson sang Wagner Lieder to sold-out crowds in Vienna. She did the Wesendonck Lieder in particular. Katarina Jarbaro, an African-American soprano, fled the Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939, lamenting that she would no longer be able to sing Wagner and other composers in her favorite opera houses in Central Europe. And in the post-war period, Black opera singers rose to prominence by singing Wagner on stage, from Grace Bumbry and Simon Estes to the late and great Jesse Norman. And I'll leave it to Alex to sort of introduce, I think, some other figures and names as well. Although my first book considered more seriously what has happened historically when Black people began to take on the music of Wagner and other composers, my next project, I think, is trying to answer a different question, which Alex is also, I think, taking up, which is, why take this music on? Why perform it at all? Why compose it at all? Why listen to it? It's important as we consider these questions to understand the obstacles and barriers that have historically stood in the way and still continue to shape our conversations on race and music in whatever genre. So African Americans represent only 1.8% of all orchestra musicians today, 1.8%. And Alex, again, I'm throwing your words back at you. In one of your essays in 2018, you addressed the problems of racism and sexism in classical music head on when you critiqued the choices of the New York Philharmonic and the Metropolitan Opera House. You write that in the age of Trump, quote, as the nation contends with its racist and misogynist demons, New York's leading musical institutions give us canonical pieces by white males, conducted by white males, directed by white males. And Alex isn't wrong. I mean, maybe this is where I can do the screen sharing thing really quickly if I can sort of show this really cool graph that I like. Let me see, screen share. Share screen. Here we go. I think I can do this. Okay. I don't know if you all can, oopsie, if you all can see it. This cool GitHub graph, which for some reason is not letting me sort of play current slide. Are you all able to see it? Hopefully, okay, right. So this is sort of this GitHub graph showing the sort of range of pieces performed by the New York Philharmonic from the 1850s to 2017, right? And so the number of pieces by a living composer just sort of drops, not like it was all that high per se, right? But it sort of drops precipitously after a while, so. And I'm going to hit end stop share. Sort of leave it there, I think, for now. Right. So anyway, I think what the GitHub graph does is it sort of reinforces the notion that, you know, or what it's demonstrating is how often this notion is reinforced that the best pieces of music were once written in the past, usually by white European men. So, and I guess to give a sort of personal anecdote that I've been thinking about a lot of sort of me starting to investigate a little bit more the history of structural and systemic racism in the world of classical music in America was a couple of years ago, starting to visit different conservatories of music and their archives for the first time in about 2015. And I started going around asking really lovely archivists at a bunch of different conservatories of music for their records on Black students who had attended their conservatory before 1945, only to be told by several of them that they had no records because the conservatory had a policy of not admitting Black students. So I have other sort of anecdotal evidence or sort of other stories that I can share, but I think for the sake of time, just looking at the clock, I'll sort of skip ahead. And say that I think the thing that's remarkable then is that in spite of racist violence and racial oppression, Black musicians continue to push for careers in classical music, and that it's worth considering that more in depth. To be blunt, I'm not entirely satisfied with some of the frameworks that we have for thinking about the lives and careers of Black classical musicians. And that instead of thinking of Black folks as simply empty vessels waiting to be filled with the glorious knowledge of Wagner, or as passive consumers of white-dominated media, I want us to consider better how they were active in their own propagation of what this music meant for them. So simply by shifting our focus onto Black agency in the production of classical music, we can also then work to dismantle the notion that classical music's dissemination in America was unidirectional, which is also, I think, work that I love so much about Alex's project and that Alex is also doing. I am going to let Alex explore the world of W.E.B. Du Bois. I'm assuming that's sort of coming up here in a little bit, but I do want us to consider just what it meant for Du Bois and for others that German music to them and the music of Wagner in particular, and this might sound like a wild stretch, but please bear with me, that it offered not just legitimization of Black talent, but potentially liberation out of white supremacist America. I'm not always convinced that practice worked. Mind you, I'm still trying to sort of work through what I think this means. But nonetheless, for someone like Du Bois, studying in Germany and going to hear Wagner operas, it was a sort of monumental discovery for him that he could love and lay claim to the same cultural works as white Americans, but on different grounds. So one last framework before we turn things over to Alex and to his work on Afro-Wagnerism, and I'm going to sort of end perhaps with this story, which is that a few years ago, I was at the American Academy in Berlin as a fellow, so was Alex at one point as well. And at the American Academy in Berlin, the post-colonial theorist Gayatri Spivak, famous for Can the Subaltern Speak? She came, and for the theory of strategic essentialism, all kinds of other things. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with their work, but she came and she used this phrase that I'm still thinking about. And the phrase is this: affirmative sabotage. Affirmative sabotage. So speaking of Du Bois in particular and his affinities to anti-colonialist South Asian thinkers, Spivak argued that Du Bois wasn't simply influenced by the Enlightenment so much as he managed to successfully sabotage it. He took the Enlightenment to a place where it needed to be reconstituted, she argues, because he had found it wanting or insufficient. Spivak calls this quote unquote affirmative sabotage because the participant knows the technology so well that they understand how to repurpose it to make it function for their own needs and desires. It is possible, in her estimation, for people to admire the machinery that they're trying to change, a technology that might be as destructive to their being as it is beautiful. Since the technology was not built for them, they're not supposed to be able to use it, but they can sabotage the device so that it no longer is what it once was. So this might sound abstract, but I think using the term affirmative sabotage helps us to investigate both the mutability of Wagnerism, as Alex has so masterfully done in his book, and to also think about the immense power of Black cultural politics in the United States. Employing it helps us to see that the practice of listening to and performing Wagner was never monolithic. Wagner in this formulation meant something different for Black classical musicians than it did for white folks in the era of Jim Crow, this era of sort of racial violence. And Black classical musicians planned to use it differently as well. How some African Americans were able to take on this music, which even by the late 1930s, people like Langston Hughes and others are starting to denounce as white and of the oppressor. This becomes a much more complex and meaningful tale than we have been willing to tell. So maybe Black dismantlings of Wagner and reimaginings of it fit Gayatri Spivak's notion of affirmative sabotage as well. What German music's universality and really hegemony could potentially offer, African-American intellectuals are arguing, was this reimagining of Blackness and whiteness, free from American definitions of race and music in the era of Jim Crow. Writing with this intimate knowledge of Wagner, they pushed then for an imagined musical space that belonged to them during an era of white violence that denied their intellectual abilities, humanity, and physical safety. So because of their visions, perhaps, Wagnerism had a far greater imaginary landscape than many of his ardent admirers could ever have conceived possible. So that is, I think, my segue, if that's all right, to sort of turn things over to Wagnerism, is to sort of think perhaps about, hopefully we'll be talking about Du Bois and sort of just how I think different Black intellectuals and different Black artists have taken this music on for themselves. So thanks.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kira. You can all hear me, right? I'm not muted. That was fantastic. Just a fantastic, it's such important work that you're doing in and of itself, as well as a great lead into my material. And I first encountered your work, I think back in 2012, 2013, this brilliant essay on Grace Bunbury's appearance at Bayreuth in the post-war years as Venus in Tannhäuser, and all the complicated layers behind that moment, which, you know, on the surface seems like it's the progressive new Bayreuth, and Grace Bunbury being welcomed into a quote-unquote denazified Bayreuth, but it's quite a bit more complicated than that. And it's wonderful the way you show that complexity while preserving the fact of the breakthrough and the fact of her, you know, achievement at that moment. But yeah, it's been wonderful as I've been working on this book to converse with you and share ideas about Wagner and African Americans, Wagner and the Black experience in Germany, and so on. And actually, you shared with me at one point the Jimenez trio performing at Wagner's birthday party at Von Fried, which I had included in a draft of the book with, of course, thanks to you. And then I ended up deciding not to use it because it was just so odd in and of itself. I mean, it needs context. It needs a lot of context. And it just sort of like put it down there. It sort of creates this mental image of, oh, Black people were showing up all the time at Wagner's house performing. And this just, you know, was he even aware that they were there? You know, how many, you know, it's just, who knows? You know, why, you know, why they came to be there is just an interesting question in itself. But yeah, to sort of give the overall frame of what I was trying to do in writing about so-called Black Wagnerism or Afro-Wagnerism, which is a phrase the scholar Samuel Dwinell has used. It is one of these many, many manifestations of these diverse and surprising relationships with Wagner that can be seen, especially in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, as this vague but ubiquitous phenomenon of Wagnerism sort of roared through all the different art forms, as well as, of course, moving into politics and sort of the general social fabric of the fin-de-siècle. I first stumbled across Du Bois and I've been aware for a long time of this remarkable story in The Souls of Black Folk of the Coming of John, where a young Black man, really just a student, is sort of undergoing education and sort of having dreams of sort of rising up in society as a kind of Booker T. Washington sort of process of self-improvement. And he goes to a concert hall and he hears the Lohengrin Prelude and is swept away and has this vision of possibility and the movement of power within him. And this is a kind of experience that we see over and over again in the annals of Wagnerism, people from all different groups encountering Wagner and being seized with a sense, not only being sort of struck by the beauty or the power of the music, but seeing their own future self somehow unfolding and sort of having this glimpse of future greatness. And it takes many, many forms, some uplifting, some quite sinister, because the young Adolf Hitler had such an experience with Wagner in his teenage years. And it seems particularly surprising to find an African-American having such an experience. When I first read about it, it seemed an isolated case, and I thought there would be a chapter. I planned all along that, of course, there would be a chapter grappling with Wagner and race and anti-Semitism and the phenomenon of the Jewish Wagnerian. And I thought that sort of this Du Bois episode would be a sort of a kind of small detour amid that discussion. But as I read more and as I got in touch with Kira and some other scholars, I realized actually this was a larger phenomenon, not a vast phenomenon by any means. A sort of quite limited group of people were engaging with Wagner, but not insignificant. You know, I don't think it wasn't just a kind of isolated freak event that Du Bois was having these experiences and investing importance in these experiences. And one sees sort of a similar, less intense engagement with Wagner, with the younger Langston Hughes, with Alan Locke, with Shirley Graham, the future wife of Du Bois, with Ralph Ellison, the young Ralph Ellison, and a number of other figures. And then I think more importantly, sort of seeing this in the context of this Black engagement with Germany and with German culture, which is even older than Du Bois, I think. Frederick Douglass had an interest in German culture and German thought. And so it is a pattern. I think it's a significant pattern. And Kira's work gives a wonderful sense of the breadth of it and the complexity of it and the sort of multiple sources of it. And so for me, the question was, as you put it, Kira, why Wagner? Why this music? And Du Bois actually, spells it out quite clearly. I think it's not a mystery kind of why Wagner appeals to him. I mean, first of all, there is this long-standing adoration of German culture, and then specifically with Wagner, he admires the use of myth. And the sort of revivification of myth, deploying the ancient legends and sagas and myths of a people, in this case the German people, to modern ends, to political ends, to sort of with the purpose of sort of forming new social and cultural unities and organisms. And so what he wrote much later in life was that, commenting on the Ring, he said, "It is as though someone of us chose out of the wealth of African folklore a body of poetic material, and with music, scene, and action, retold for mankind the suffering and triumphs and defeats of a people." And so quite obviously he's saying that African-American artists can use their own native material as Wagner did, and make it the foundation for great expansive artworks of the future. And in his very late autobiographical novel, Worlds of Color, Du Bois writes of a sort of fictionalized version of himself. He thought how among American Negroes, legend and fantasy might thus be wed to histrionic ability and imagination to build a great dramatic tradition. And I think when you use that wonderful phrase, affirmative sabotage, I mean, that is what is going on here. I mean, maybe not even, I mean, it's just sort of, it's an appropriation. It's a very direct appropriation of sort of the Wagnerian idea to his own sense of cultural mission. And there weren't many others who sort of put this as strongly as he did, but it was a lifelong kind of interest that he had with Wagner, and a kind of central preoccupation. And I think the mechanism here, and it's sort of very important to sort of talk about this question of influence and kind of bracket this idea of influence. And it's not simply a sense of kind of Du Bois letting himself become a conduit for Wagner's ideas, and what I talk about again and again in this book is sort of the complexity and the sort of double-sidedness of this engagement with Wagner, which can begin as a sort of moment of being overwhelmed by the music, a kind of submission to the music, being almost subjugated by it. But then sort of somehow by the time the subjugated listener emerges at the other end of the experience, he or she has reshaped the work, Wagner's work, in a way that often tears it away from sort of Wagner's apparent intentions and context, and remakes it completely. So there's this sort of process of being subjugated, but then taking possession and transforming the work sort of almost beyond recognition. And this, Baudelaire is the first great case of this in 1861. He talks about being literally penetrated by the music, is the particular phrase that he uses. But in the end, he has completely transformed Wagner into sort of material for the French avant-garde obsessions and preoccupations. And so that happens again and again in different contexts. And just Du Bois is a good example of this. And so that's a sort of a different kind of sort of sense of influence. And there can, in terms of that word sabotage, there can very often be a kind of hostile sort of edge to this relationship, particularly if you have someone like Nietzsche, who's another classic case of sort of this being kind of this early phase of infatuation and submission, and then needs to back away from it, needs to reject it. But in the process, he is subsuming these ideas from Wagner and transforming them for his own uses, so that this kind of, I call it the agon, this back and forth central Nietzschean idea, this agon in which the sort of younger rival defeats the older and sort of takes possession. So it is a kind of war, you know, and all of these sort of Wagnerisms can be so wildly contradictory and just completely at cross purposes. So there's a couple of other things I want to touch on. One is, okay, what about Wagner himself? And how does Wagner's notorious racism factor into this? And here I think we need to be a little bit careful, because there can be sort of this generalist idea that you know, Wagner is one of the most notorious racists in artistic history. But it is ultimately about his anti-Semitism. There is an idea of white supremacy in Wagner, sort of Aryan supremacy, but it is not really the driving preoccupation. His entire preoccupation is this paranoid obsession with Jews in particular. And everything else is rather hazy. And he read Gobineau, and he was very interested in Gobineau's ideas, but he sort of disagreed with Gobineau on some points as well, and preferred this sort of scheme that he presents in his later writings, which is really almost incomprehensible. I mean, it's undoubtedly racist, but it doesn't conform particularly well to the sort of emergent racist consensus of biological sort of pseudoscientific kind of hierarchies of racists. So it's all a bit obscure. And in terms of his feelings about Black people, there's not that much evidence. This certainly was something that he had very little to say about, and it did not preoccupy him. And actually in the Diaries of Cosimo Wagner, you can see him saying a number of fairly sympathetic things about African Americans in particular. And he's reading Thomas Carlyle and becomes incensed at Carlyle's anti-Black attitudes. He has he's obviously on the side of the Union side in the Civil War. He praises the Zulu leader Cetshwayo, whom he's looking at a picture of and describes as a very handsome and formidable man. So these sort of surprising moments of sympathy, which of course, you know, Wagner had almost no face-to-face acquaintance with Black people, and it just wasn't his. It was sort of easy for him to sort of say, well, look at these Americans and you know, their problems, and to sort of take a superior attitude toward American racial attitudes while being completely blind, you know, to his own, which is sort of something you find very often in European commentary, especially on America in the period. But nonetheless, it's a kind of an interesting absence of any sort of really ferocious racist rhetoric, and as I said, these moments of sympathy. And then there's the matter of Ira Aldridge and Lorana Aldridge, and this is something that I stumbled across as I was in the early stages of working on the book. When I came across this name, Lorana Aldridge, who actually, you mentioned her in the I think a footnote to your Grace Bunbury paper. I'd seen a mention of her in Herbert Marshall and Mildred Stock's biography of her father, Ira Aldridge, the great African-American Shakespearean actor. And there was this mention of sort of something having to do with Bayreuth. She sang at Bayreuth, or she was going to sing at Bayreuth in 1896. And Eileen Southern mentions this in passing briefly somewhere as well. And I read that and I was like, you know, what is going on there? And so I maniacally started trying to find traces of sort of learn more about this woman, Lorana Aldridge. And here I will try a share screen moment. So there she is. Can you see her? Can you see? Can everyone see? No? No.
We're seeing the desktop, Alex.
The desktop, okay. Now? No?
Just
all right. New share? Yes, okay, there she is, the magnificent picture of Lorana Aldridge. And so I was able to piece together more of the story than was really known in the sources, particularly when I stumbled across went to the archives at Northwestern and found the papers of Amanda Aldridge, her sister. And there I discovered that picture, and also a letter which had been misidentified as a letter from Eva Wagner, Wagner and Cosima's daughter, which in fact was a letter from Cosima Wagner herself, the widow of the Meister, the Meisterin, as she is known. And sort of the whole story sort of became evident that Cosima had cast Lorana Aldridge, who was a rising contralto, who had been much praised by figures such as Charles Gounod. Cosima had cast her to sing one of the Valkyries in the Ring at Bayreuth in 1896, which is a big occasion because it was the first time that the Ring had been done at Bayreuth since the premiere of the cycle in 1876. And then she fell sick and was not able to sing. And the letter that I found was in the wake of that episode, as Lorana was inquiring whether she could come back for the next year's festival, and Cosima said, unfortunately, everything has already been cast. But it was a very, very polite, very thoughtful letter with a sort of note of criticism as well, that Cosima seemed to think that Lorana wasn't managing her voice properly, or sort of needed a bit more training. And it's just quite astounding because Bayreuth in 1896 and 97 is when the festival is being increasingly infested by extreme racist thinking, including Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who would go on to write The Foundations of the 19th Century, this evil masterwork of racist philosophy that had a huge influence in the early 20th century. And yet here is Cosima having this not only a civil exchange with a Black singer or mixed race singer, but actually Lorana Aldridge seemed to have been invited into the family to some extent. She was staying at Wahnfried, at the Wagner Villa, and became very close with Eva, the daughter. And there are a couple of notes, friendly notes back and forth, or notes from Eva to Lorana. And Eva would go on to marry Houston Stewart Chamberlain. So very strange things are happening here. And what it says to me is, even as Bayreuth was tilting, the whole Wagner operation was tilting more and more in the direction of this ideology of hyper-nationalism and anti-Semitism. There was also this cosmopolitan tradition at Bayreuth, and this sense of sort of different groups could come to Bayreuth and feel comfortable. It was known to be welcoming to gay people, for example. It was an eccentric and sort of somewhat bohemian place, as well as a watering hole for the wealthy. And so it's actually, on second thought, not too surprising that Cosima would have made this idiosyncratic gesture of casting Lorana Aldridge. So these are some of those few of the layers of material that I incorporate into my sort of half of a chapter on Black Wagnerism in my book, and it gives a sense of the sort of richness and sense of possibility of Wagnerism at the turn of the century, which then would be steadily narrowed and closed down. And sort of the general narrative of the book is sort of this aesthetic and kind of cultural expansion, together with this kind of grinding ideological narrowing. And so those are the sort of the contrary energies of the phenomenon in that period. And I think those contradictory, conflicting energies are still with us today whenever we confront Wagner. So that's sort of my general spiel. So I'll throw it back to you, Kira. I'm just wondering if you have sort of particular thoughts about Wagner singers and this engagement with Wagner and sort of what it might mean on a sort of deeper social, cultural level.
I mean, I think one thing that comes out in your book, I mean, again, I think of the phrase or the term mutability a lot when I think about what you're sort of showing, the sort of multiple meanings of Wagner and how even the term Wagnerism, right, is sort of not fully able to capture, I think, entirely sort of what's going on at various moments. But I mean, one thing I was thinking of is, as you were sharing your presentation, was just, what is it about Wagner that lends itself so well to transformation or to sort of potentials of transformation and perhaps transfiguration, to like throw in Nietzsche there or something, death and transfiguration, you know, that there's something with perhaps getting back to Du Bois a little bit and his fascination with Wagner that suggests, and I mean, I leave this to you to sort of perhaps theorize and not me, but that suggests there's something particular to Wagner that proposes the potentials of transformation. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is sort of one of the basic properties, I think, of the music is that it has this intense visceral effect, and yet it can somehow attach itself to almost anything. You know, we see that in Hollywood, and sort of Wagner's ability to become attached to sort of romantic scenes and melodramas and Helicopters and Apocalypse Now and Bugs Bunny and sort of creepy scenes in Visconti movies and sort of gorgeous apocalyptic landscapes in Werner Herzog and so on and so forth. There is this adaptability and mutability. And I think somehow, because, first of all, just because of the properties of the music itself, it does have these certain power of hypnosis and this kind of sort of this phantasmagoria that the Wagner orchestra creates, as Theodor Adorno talked about, sort of puts us into a bit of a dream state, and that's something that Baudelaire immediately identified. And even as Wagner seems to be such a domineering figure with his millions of words of prose writings and his nonstop spewing of ideas and instructions and opinions about everything under the sun, you know, despite what seems to be the sort of this excess of meaning, of sort of signification on the part of the composer himself, it all seems to evaporate at some point, and sort of the listener's own convictions and impressions invade and take over. And I think ultimately that has to do with this brilliant manipulation of myth and legend, you know, which is just always so ready to be used, sort of, and reused and endlessly reapplied as allegory, as metaphor, pulling the sword from the tree of the stone, the ring of power, you know, the god falling from a great height, the young hero or the young initiate discovering his or her kind of innate unknown abilities, so on and so forth. These can just be, you know, it's sort of unstoppable, you know, in terms of their you know, reception and kind of sort of reinvention in the wider cultural field, which is why I think you see so many of them being replicated in Hollywood film, and especially in kind of fantasy culture of the late 20th century. One other thing that sort of sprang to mind was, I think especially sort of in the early 20th century, how Black intellectuals and Black figures kind of play Germany off against the United States in a way. So they say, you know, Du Bois famously or infamously said that he felt more free in Germany, not only when he was studying in the 1890s. He said the same thing when he went to the Bayreuth Festival in 1936.
Right.
and it's, and this is, you're not quite sure how to take this. Does he really mean this? Or is this kind of a propagandistic gesture on his part to say, like, even in Nazi Germany, and he's unambiguous about the horror of anti-Semitism, the essential nature of Nazi racism. He says, still, I felt more comfortable. Jesse Owens said the same thing, more or less. When Jesse Owens came back after the Olympics, he said it wasn't Hitler who snubbed me, it was FDR who snubbed me. I wasn't invited to the White House. I didn't get a congratulatory telegram. And then he ended up campaigning for Alf Landon. That's a whole other very complicated episode. But so it is a device to some extent to sort of play Germany off against America.
Yeah, so, I mean, if it helps, there's a book. Maybe some people know it, but if not, it's a really easy, fun read called A Breath of Freedom. It's about African-American soldiers stationed in West Germany after sort of Nazism, so 1945 to about 1955, I want to say, 1960s. And yeah, it's about how a lot of African Americans sort of would say in different ways that there's this sort of fascinating quote about it. Like, I had to come to sort of like recently Nazi, now Nazi-free Germany to discover like what it meant to be free or something. So, and oftentimes I think it is a strong indictment of the United States, like, which we can get into sort of the ways in which that sort of functions, but it oftentimes is sort of functioning as a strong indictment. The thing I'm still thinking about, which is I think a lot of what your work is doing, it's so interesting to me that the way that you structured your book is almost entirely pre-1945. And then you have the sort of a post-1945 chapter. And I think what that's doing, to my mind, in some ways is forcing us to think a little bit more about that we have such a strong idea of Wagner post-45 in our minds, or sort of what Wagner's racism means, what Wagner's anti-Semitism means, and that it is so charged, obviously and understandably, because of Nazism and the Holocaust, but that it seems like there are so many different moments, maybe missed moments, missed opportunities, but so many moments before that where we could imagine and see Wagner differently. I don't know if that's sort of, and so the other thing I was then thinking about, perhaps relatedly, is if tied to this idea of transformation, or sort of what is going on here. I really love this phrase that you just said, sort of about Wagner being replicable. And then I'm wondering if it's actually not about transformation at all, so much as it is about the replicability, if I want to use that word, of Wagner, whether it's the music itself or whether it's his ideas or something that that sort of, it seems like, just births all of these different kinds of Wagnerisms before 1945 in these different ways. We haven't talked about, Alex, for example, Alan Locke, who appears in your book in a bunch of different places. Although I was really happy to see him actually appear in your Venusberg chapter, sort of in gay Wagner, not only in Black Wagner, right? And that, like, to my mind, thinking about perhaps going back to transformation, maybe more specifically, that again, Alan Locke begins his like famous essay, The New Negro, with a Wagnerian reference, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Norns. Yeah, this is, I mean, it's the sort of wonderfully unexpected episode, and when Hughes goes on this, Langston Hughes goes on this Wagnerian vacation. It's a Venetian vacation with Wagnerian elements, with Alan Locke, and it seems to have been an attempted and apparently unsuccessful seduction. But in the course of it, they go look at the Palazzo Giustiniani, where Wagner worked on Parsifal in the late 1850s, and then they see the Palazzo Vendramin, where Wagner died, and this is a sort of itinerary that was just actually quite common, it seems, for gay, sort of Wagner-loving gay tourists, and Venice, to this day. I mean, I sort of felt obliged to go to see all these places as well, with the gondolas and the gondoliers and everything. And so it was, yeah, I enjoyed being able to put that moment in a different context and to sort of show how a figure like Locke, I think, overlaps with, several different trajectories and kind of profiles of what it means to be a Wagnerian in the early 20th century. I noticed Kira Gaunt saying, reductive to read Owen's comment as a binary. Yeah, I certainly didn't mean to imply that he was approving of Hitler or in any way. Just that he sort of used this sort of mention of Hitler as a way to,
if I could interject,
FDR sort of criticize American, just sort of saying that it's worse. It's simply a way to dramatize, I suppose, the situation of the African American at home to make this kind of reference. But there's absolutely no doubt that Hitler was horrified by the idea of the possibility of being photographed with Jesse Owens or having to shake his hand. So that's.
If I can, if I can offer two readings that might be helpful to folks interested in this kind of question, or sort of, that this is a constant rhetorical device, I feel like that's sort of that African Americans are using in the 19th and 20th centuries. One is a reading by Maria Diedrich on African American journalists in Germany in the 1920s and in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. In which they are doing this thing where they're like, I'm fine, I'm having a great time. And she's like, what are they doing? Why are they saying that? So she sort of is taking this time to sort of explore, like, who are they interacting with? Who are they seeing? And sort of pointing out, the complexities of, in some ways, the sort of desire to indict the United States. But she argues, as does this other text by somebody named Robbie Aitken, Aitken, Robbie Aitken, also an African-American journalist in Nazi Germany, that this is sort of this rhetorical device. Unfortunately, what they're doing at the same time, in order to maintain this, in order to keep saying that life is fine for them, what they oftentimes do is they kind of throw Afro-Germans and African Germans under the bus. So African migrants who were there, or Afro-Germans who are having a terrible time, who are saying that they're having a terrible time, these African-American journalists don't listen to them or are not willing to listen, or they say, oh, it's because they're darker skinned, or they say, oh, it's because they got in trouble with the law. And so they come up with a list of justifications in order to maintain this sort of perspective that life in Germany is better or can potentially be better than in the United States.
Right. Yeah. Eric wants us to go to questions, but
yes, we should start going to questions.
One more thing about your latest essay, Kira, on Black leader singers in Germany and Austria in the 1920s, mostly into the 30s. Roland Hayes, especially, and Marian Anderson, and how there is kind of a one framing of those appearances that you hear that because of racism, these singers weren't able to have a proper career in the U.S. and when they went to Germany, when they went to Austria, at this wonderful time, and they sort of received all this applause, and Marian was hailed as, and you show that it was far more complex than that, of course, and there was a constant racist undertow or an explicit racism in the critical commentary, and as personal experience, it was not always comfortable.
I mean, it's complicated because I do at the same time want to acknowledge their experiences and want to acknowledge that they might feel differently. They do feel differently. They're like, well, hey, in Germany, I can use any fountain I want, right? I can book a hotel in any room that I want. Like it, so there is a way in which we can kind of, I think, and this is also what your work is doing, sort of acknowledge the complexities of this experience and sort of at least point to these different dynamics at work and be like, there are these different, we can't just sort of block one thing out or only focus on the other. It's a both and, sort of not an either or when we're thinking about Black experiences with Wagner or with Germany or whatever.
Right. Okay, so let's...
Questions, right, I think...
Okay. I'm calling on people in the order that they posted questions. And first up is Ann Powers, who had a question about the Du Bois story, Alex.
Hi, that was really great. Thank you both. I'm so edified by what you presented. Yeah, Alex, I was just thinking about the story itself on the coming of John, and the way in which in the story it feels in some ways that the narrative is structurally similar, or to, I mean, I don't say similar, it's operatic, and the climax, the conclusion, and the sort of fatalism of it, you know. And I wonder if you think that was on purpose, like this idea that a listener, I don't know, particularly a listener of color, I don't know, or just a listener in general, you know, might be somehow not simply moved, but like taken over and thrust into a story of operatic proportions by the experience of encountering the opera. And if you found that throughout, you know, looking at the way different artists, writers dealt with how the reception of Wagner's work affects people.
Yeah. That's a great question. And actually, I wish I'd thought of that because when at the end of the story, and the white lynch mob is approaching, and he knows that he's about to meet his end, and there's the sound of the galloping horses is sort of filling his ears, but his mind goes back to Lohengrin. And he sort of a snippet of Lohengrin sort of runs through his head, and that is a very operatic device. You know, just very often you find, you know, in a sort of at the tragic end of an opera, a sort of a snippet of something heard earlier comes back, Le Donne Mobile, or whatever it is, as this sort of tragic glimpse of the sweetness which, you know, had existed before, which is now being, you know, destroyed. And so it becomes an operatic story. I don't know whether, I mean, it's the sort of the forces that are gripping John in that story are not of his making, you know, so he's being destroyed by this massive, this sort of systemic force. Maybe there's an idea that's this Wagner experience and sort of this glimpse of future greatness sort of emboldens him in a way that makes him more confrontational. It certainly doesn't make him, you know, meek and sort of wanting to sort of melt away into the background, and perhaps that plays a role. But yeah, the blurring between the kind of the social scene of someone's listening to Wagner, it's a kind of part of the sort of fabric of the late 19th century, early 20th century, and somehow that kind of blending into Wagner and these sort of mythic ideas in Wagner as background, sort of the deep background, and how they had sort of, it moves from the sort of social foreground to the mythic background over the course of the story is something that happens a lot, especially happens in Willa Cather. That kind of sort of bifurcation is sort of so many of Cather's references to Wagner play out in that sort of double-tracked way. And there is, you know, just very often you see these scenes where it's sort of the Wagner seduces, especially young women. It sort of creates a state of vulnerability, which can sometimes lead to sort of erotic liberation, but sometimes it allows the sort of predatory male to sort of move in, and sort of the anti-Wagnerian authors are sort of saying, you know, women shouldn't be listening to Wagner because it makes them, you know, prey, sort of vulnerable to evil males. So it, you know, there's very different ways that sort of plays out. But yeah, it's a fascinating ambiguity. And sort of Wagner's kind of seeps from the realist level into the mythic level.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Gus Stadler. Gus, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you both so much. Hey, Alex, it's been a long time.
Yeah.
That was really fascinating and really stimulating. And I guess this is for either or both of you, but I was just really thinking about James Weldon Johnson's Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man as you were talking, and this, you know, where the protagonist is a musician and he's you know, trained musician and classical musician, and goes to Germany and has this, like, you know, epiphany about classical music and ragtime. He's listening to some German piano player play, and I was thinking about how, you know, that book kind of uses a sort of like a metaphor of continuity, or like an idea of continuity to figure the relationship between African-American music and European classical music. And it seems like that's not really how Du Bois, I mean, I could be wrong, but it seems like that's not exactly how he thinks of it. But I'm interested in your response to that, but also just kind of, you know, my bigger question is just like, how does one understand Du Bois as a listener of both spirituals and Wagner? I mean, obviously spirituals are different idiom than ragtime, but you know, then also there's also the factor of the Fist singers and their versions of spirituals. So anyway, that's a whole bunch of stuff, but I'm just interested in your responses.
Kara, do you want to jump in?
I mean, sure. I can tackle that. I think as how I understand it, really quickly, because I know there are other questions popping up. It seems like, which is to say, I think he and Du Bois are on the same page in a lot of ways. That I think we forget it now because perhaps we take it for granted. But you know, in the late 19th, early 20th century, the question was: is there such a thing as African American art music? Right? Like, can that exist? Like, what? And how do we build that repertoire? How do we do that? And so for Du Bois, the answer was like, Wagner offers us a model, like sort of, you know, that this is in some ways what we should be aspiring to, right? Of course, we still need to do it ourselves. Like, it still needs to, we need to generate the music. It still needs to sort of, you know, but that nonetheless, I think in both formulations, what you're seeing is a sort of interest and a fascination in the question of like, what could potentially African-American art music sound like, right, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And then I think one last thing I'll say about the James Weldon Johnson piece. I'm like so mad it didn't make it into my book, but not really. But you know, but it's no surprise to me that the musician who helps the protagonist have this awakening is German. Right, that's the one who's sort of leading him to realize that like he has it within him to sort of compose, you know, art music. And this is, you know, like the pianist who, like the German pianist demonstrating it for him, you know, sort of showing him what it in theory can sound like, right? It's like starting off as Brahms, but then it sort of becomes ragtime and like sort of mixing the two together. That, you know, that was sort of the goal for like a lot of different composers, like Nathaniel Dett, right? Sort of an African composer in the early 20th century as well. Yeah, okay, although if I can say one thing about the previous conversation that Anne and Alex had, the one thing I think to maybe like, the historian in me is sort of thinking about it is as John is, you know, because John is like from the South, right? And he goes up to New York City and hears Wagner for the first time. And I think it is worth keeping in mind, like how many opportunities could somebody like John have had before going to New York City to ever hear Wagner? And not simply because, or only if like this idea that Wagner is rare to hear outside of New York City. It's also the question of like, were Black people allowed in concert halls, right? Were they allowed in these different classical music spaces? And is that also part of the reason why this music is so shocking to him, if he had never really had opportunities to hear it before?
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah. Y'all just had one more. I want to mention Harry Lawrence Freeman, who began work on this, was infatuated by Wagner at an early age, heard Tannhäuser, and I think was sort of more or less inspired to become an opera composer from that experience, or at least that's what he later said, and eventually embarked on this ambitious cycle of tetralogy of African-themed operas, sort of very obviously patterned after The Ring. And this was actually before Du Bois made those remarks in 1936 about Wagner as a mythic model for African American artists. So this idea had already occurred to Freeman well before, and it's also sort of implicit to some extent, I think, in Shirley Graham's projects, Tom Tom and especially Deep River, which used Wagner music from Götterdämmerung as part of this collage soundtrack of many different musical sources, including as well as Graham's own music. So yes, more going on than one might expect.
So we have a question from Eric now, and that's actually the last question that we have in the chat section. So if anybody wants to rush in one or two more before we run out of time, make your presence known now. But go ahead, Eric.
Oh, it was really very straightforward. I was promised jazz. Give me some jazz.
All right. Yeah. Sorry with the. I may have oversold this element in the précis that I sent out because there's just not much time for it now. But it's another strand of all this. One that is very difficult to make sort of big claims about, but nonetheless, there is Wagner in jazz. There's everything in jazz, of course. There's nothing exceptional about a classical composer being sort of excerpted and manipulated and thrown into the mix in a jazz composition. But there was actually a little tradition of playing around with Wagner, jazzing up Wagner, or even before jazz existed. There were these French sort of playful salon versions of Wagner, often executed by devout Wagnerians such as Emmanuel Chabrier, who perhaps as a way to check the intensity of their infatuation needed to sort of step back and sort of present this sort of more satirical, playful vision of the Wagner experience. And we have John Philip Sousa's Wagner. Maybe not one of Sousa's more electrifying recordings. So Wagner was very much in the band repertory, the popular band repertory. One of my favorite quotations in the book is actually from Sousa, who said he was sort of talking about my two favorite pieces, or my two most popular pieces, are Stars and Stripes Forever and the Tannhäuser Overture. Then he said, Wagner was a brass band man anyway. Just, it sort of solves all the Wagner problems. He was just a brass band man. Nothing more needs to be said. And then you have Clément Doucet in Paris in the 1920s, writing these wonderful little playful, I don't know if this is somewhere between cafe music and ragtime and maybe a little bit of jazz. Those are the Parsifal bells. Bum, 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 bum. Now this is a very casual version of the Pilgrims Chorus from Tannhäuser. And so then we get to Donald Lambert. So Donald Lambert was a figure who I was not really acquainted with until Ethan Iverson alerted me to him. Obviously fantastically gifted and virtuosic stride pianist. And this is his version of the Pilgrims Chorus. And you can see how it sounds quite a bit like the Doucet, especially at the beginning. And he may have known this Doucet piece, but then he spins it off in a quite different direction. Can everyone hear okay? You can hear the music? Yes, no? Should I turn it up? So that's an excellent example of affirmative sabotage, I think. And just one more, I'll skip the god-awful Stan Kenton Ride of the Valkyries and play a little Charlie Parker. Oops, let me try to play a little more of that. So that's the song to the Evening Star from Tannhäuser, thrown in seamlessly kind of interwoven the way these quotations so often were in Charlie Parker.
Thank you.
So that's
you see Grubbs in the comments mentioning Anthony Braxton as well.
Braxton quotes Wagner. I know.
We might have to bring David on screen.
No, he's a great fan of Wagner.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah.
Well, that makes sense to me, actually, given his sort of mythic operatic apparatus. So yeah, that's a brief history of Wagnerian jazz. What you make of it, whether any kind of larger social, political, cultural, implications could be drawn from these scattered examples, I don't know, probably not. But it is sort of a lively little epilogue to the bigger themes we've been talking about.
Excellent.
Well, that seems like a good place to wrap up, coming full circle on affirmative sabotage. So I really want to thank Kira and Alex for being here with us, and for everybody participating in the comments and the questions. And remind you that next week we'll have Julie Height hosting Peter LaChapelle and Stephanie Vanderwell talking country. And we hope many of you will come back and join us then. But let's give a round of thanks to our speakers.